by manipulating all these minerals in a coherent way, you can actually balance the ratios much faster than if you just trust the whole process of, my body will sort itself out. All I have to do is more of this, that, or the other thing. I mean, from my own personal experience, and part of what really convinced me that HTMA was profoundly important was that I was used to using 30 milligram doses of zinc because no one had shown me how to use higher doses. And then I started to use higher doses of zinc at Clark's suggestion and got very different results. And so when you think about that in context, what I want you all to understand is that if you think about how long it's going to take you eating a regular diet to get an extra 30 milligrams of zinc a day, it's not going to happen. You'd have to eat like 3 or 4 steaks, and you'd have to absorb the zinc from those steaks. It's not going to happen. Now we're talking about 60 extra milligrams of zinc. The same thing can be true of copper. There are situations in which we'll use a higher dose of copper, right? And if you go back and look at the data I shared from a typical day of a typical person's diet, eating 2 to 3 milligrams of copper a day, well, how on earth are you going to get to 4 or 5 or 6 milligrams a day? You're going to be eating cashews or pistachios or pecans for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and you're going to get tired of eating the sheer quantity of food, let alone the macros that you may need in order to get high doses of these trace elements. And often people come back and say, well, wait a minute, why are we needing these high doses in our modern world, which is another great topic, right? We live in a world where we're set up for copper toxicity because we have copper piping in certain homes where the copper is going to get into the water supply and then all the food. I'm not a fan of using copper to store water or drink out of copper pitchers or cooking in copper-lined cookware. I don't think that's a good idea, particularly in our modern world. You'll see that women who've been on some kind of hormonal replacement of any kind of estrogen will tend to have copper toxicity and will tend to have higher levels of copper in their blood. I've seen levels as high as 215 on birth control. And so what people are set up for this high copper situation, and then they have I'm not exactly sure. I have my suspicions about why zinc levels are low chronically in the public. I think it's over farming, it's depletion of our soils, it's a lack of or failure to put zinc into our soil amendments or fertilizers. I also think it has to do with stress, poor sleep, chronic activation of our bioenergetic system, so to speak, then running those zinc stores down. But it's just overwhelming that you see this pattern where people are generally more in need of zinc than copper across the population.
True. And that's true in my practice as well, where there are situations, even in the situations where we give higher dose copper, we're still giving zinc with it, which I think kind of speaks to another really interesting idea or principle here. And this goes back to the interactions that I was talking about before. But there are these mineral interactions, right? And a lot of people know of like zinc and copper are directly antagonistic. Less well known that copper and calcium are synergistic, or you can raise calcium by giving copper. Obecker noticed this in some of his work, and this was also done by William Albrecht, and then Dr. Paul Eck did this with the hair analysis. But the interactions are even more complicated than even what we're saying here, where yes, zinc and copper are antagonistic to one another, but there are situations where if you give copper along with the zinc will be better utilized when you give the copper along with it. And that's true for iron and copper as well, where they're directly antagonistic to one another at higher doses and above certain thresholds, but copper is required for iron utilization to mobilize iron from the storage into the active form.